Hi, everyone. I think for the interest of time, we'll get started here and people can kind of just hop on as they join. I just want to welcome everyone and thank you all for joining today's webinar on the Smart Energy Communities Scorecard that we recently launched. My name is Samantha Heigl. I am the lead project manager for the Smart Energy Communities Scorecard project here. I'm glad to be kicking things off here on the webinar today on behalf of Quest and Pollution Probe to share more information and plans surrounding the Smart Energy Community Scorecard, as well as to answer any questions you might have regarding this scorecard here. We'll be working together over the next 2 years to develop this tool to evaluate and benchmark smart energy communities across Canada. The scorecard is being generously supported by Suncor Energy Foundation and the Maxwell Foundation. So I think what we'll do is we'll get started and we will go over a few administrative details first, such as the agenda and a few other housekeeping issues. So as you can see on the screen here, we are kicking things off here with myself, just giving a brief welcome. I will then have the pleasure of turning things over to Sarah Marchionda, where she can give a general overview about what the Smart Energy Community Scorecard is, what we're hoping to achieve, and some of the outcomes of the scorecard itself. Following Sarah's presentation, we'll then switch things over to Dave Ribeiro from ACEEE, the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy down in the States. They have a similar scorecard where they benchmark cities, states, and utilities. And this is where we're kind of bouncing our ideas off of and basing this Smart Energy Community Scorecard off of. So we are lucky enough today to be joined by Dave, who will then give a little bit of information on their City Efficiency Scorecard. At the very end, we'll have some time for Q&A. This will be facilitated here by myself. Just a note that if there are any questions throughout the presentations, please definitely feel free to type your questions into the question box. We do have quite a few people online today, so we are going to keep everyone on mute just to cut down on background noise. So like I said, if there are questions that come up throughout any of the presentations or during the Q&A period, please feel free to type the questions into the question box, and we will make sure that they get addressed in that final Q&A period. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to turn things over to Sarah Marchionda.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Sam. Can you hear me okay?
We sure can, Sarah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So just before we jump into what a smart energy community is and a little bit more detail on the scorecard, I just want to take a moment to talk about the energy issues that we're facing in Canada today and the central role that communities have to play in meeting Canada's energy and climate change objectives. So just for the purpose of what we're trying to accomplish with the Smart Energy Communities Scorecard, when we talk about communities, we're using a definition of a community in the sense of a political boundary. So we're looking at a municipality as a whole, or an Indigenous community as a whole, in some cases a regional municipality, but we're looking at a community on that broader scale. So the charts on the screen show us that communities are responsible for the majority of energy end use in Canada, and that is through the way we use energy to power, heat, and cool our buildings, in our transportation networks, and in our waste supply chains. Communities account for nearly 60% of energy used in Canada, and that translates to over half of all greenhouse gas emissions nationally. The chart that you're seeing on the right shows that under a business as usual scenario, the amount of energy consumed at the community level could increase by 75% above 2006 levels by 2050. So that is, if we continue to plan for and manage the production and distribution and use of energy the same way as we have over the next 30 years, energy will increase significantly. And these two statistics alone show that Canada cannot achieve its objectives of both growing the economy and reducing emissions and building resilience without focusing on the efficient use of energy at the local level, as well as the production and distribution of low carbon sources of energy in Canadian communities. So I'll just move on to the next slide. In recent years, Quest, with many of our supporting research partners, have been able to document that over 400 communities across Canada are actively engaged in fostering an energy transition at the local level today. And those 400 communities represent over 50% of the population. That includes both Indigenous and municipal communities. There's also been a wave of supporting enabling policies at the federal, provincial, and territorial levels for community energy planning and the implementation of community-scale energy measures. Many communities have started to look at using energy as a means for achieving a broad range of community objectives. So that includes, of course, environmental objectives around greenhouse gas emissions reductions, but also economic development objectives, health objectives, resilience objectives, and other socioeconomic objectives. And what we've learned through our research is while there's tremendous momentum building around energy and a focus on energy at the local level, communities are continuing to face challenges when it comes to fully realizing an energy transition at the local level. There is no common understanding right now in Canada of what success looks like. And there's no standard approach for measuring that success from community to community across provinces and territories. So moving on to the next slide, that is really what brings us to the concept of smart energy communities, which focus on applying a truly integrated approach to planning for and managing energy at the local level. Smart energy communities entailed planning, design, implementation, and governance of integrated energy systems at the local level in a way that maximizes energy performance while cutting costs, reducing environmental impacts, and strengthening the socioeconomic conditions of a community. And they're characterized by four major components. Firstly, smart energy communities improve energy efficiency. So from building automation to streetlights, they take advantage of the full potential of energy efficiency and capitalize on lower energy costs, cutting greenhouse gas emissions, and improving operating performance. Secondly, they integrate conventional energy networks so that electricity, natural gas, and district energy and transportation fuel networks are better coordinated to match energy needs with the most efficient energy source. And when conventional energy networks are integrated in that manner, it opens the door to innovations like alternative fuel vehicles, energy storage, waste heat capture, and combined heat and power. Third, smart energy communities harness local energy opportunities. And this can be stock opportunities like energy efficiency, solar, wind, geothermal, or it can be opportunities that are tailored to a community like water source cooling, sewage heat capture, biomass for heating, biogas for electricity, and transportation fuel. And finally, the last component of a smart energy community is a community that integrates land use and transportation, recognizing that poor land use decisions can result in a tremendous amount of energy waste at the local level. So the solution, a smart energy community solution will be different from community to community, but the unifying principle is that integrating infrastructure and processes will help communities conserve energy and use energy much more efficiently. So I'll move on to the next slide just to talk about the 12 policy and technical principles that define or provide a guiding framework for what a smart energy community looks like. And you can find a little bit more of an elaborated version of the principles on the Quest website using the link at the bottom of the screen. The principles were developed almost 10 years ago now. They've been endorsed by the Council of Energy Ministers. And what's important to consider when reading through these principles is that they don't advocate for a particular fuel or an energy source or technology, but rather they focus on performance and results in a community. So in other words, just to my point earlier, there's maybe not necessarily a common pathway for all communities to get to a smart energy community, but we have these principles to act as a guiding framework. And this is what the scorecard, this is the foundation that the scorecard is going to focus on. So I'll move on to the next slide. So while the principles, the Smart Energy Community principles have stood the test of time and they continue to be highly relevant for guiding decision making, there's still no standard or common understanding of what it means to have achieved the principles. So we know anecdotally of some examples of smart energy communities in Canada, and even then that the definition of scale varies when we talk about communities. I think the interpretation of the size of what a community is and the definition of a community varies depending on who it is you're connecting with. So right now there isn't really an effective way to measure the progress of smart energy communities, and again, there's not yet a benchmark for success for what a smart energy community looks like. And furthermore, it's important to acknowledge that through the process, there's a lot of complexities associated with transitioning to a smart energy community. So getting to a smart energy community requires interventions that span across spatial boundaries. They span across multiple jurisdictions. In some cases, decision-making is happening at different levels of government, and it's not always clear-cut whose jurisdiction it is around as it relates to decision-making. And then the transition to a smart energy community also requires multiple sectors to collaborate at the local level. So this isn't just about interventions that a local government can undertake. Rather, it's just as important to have other key stakeholders like utilities, the real estate sector, the public engaged in a broader energy transition. So with the scorecard, we're hoping to recognize these many layers of complexity, and we're hoping to begin to answer some of the unknowns, particularly around some of these key challenges that I've just mentioned. We'll move on to the next slide. The Smart Energy Communities Scorecard will be completed in 2019. It's a 2-year project. It's going to be the first platform of its kind that defines a benchmark for what a smart energy community looks like, and which evaluates how the policies and processes of a community, including the key stakeholders I've just mentioned, the local government, utilities, and the real estate sector, are enabling the community as a whole to progress along the pathway to becoming a smart energy community. So in this project, the scorecard will begin by scoring a small sample of communities. And for those of you listening, we currently have an open call for expressions of interest to work with 6 pilot communities across Canada to participate in the scorecard. I'll share a little bit more on the details of that at the end of the presentation. And the way it's going to unfold is Quest with Pollution Probe is going to lead the scoring process. So we will work to develop indicators and a methodology, and then work with communities, the 6 pilot communities that we select, as well as other organizations, to validate the work that we're doing and to obtain consistent, relevant, and reliable data to inform the scoring process. The long-term goal is to update the scorecard on an ongoing basis, and we would like in the long term to grow the number of communities that we evaluate. So I want to pause here for a moment just to elaborate on the focus that I've just touched on, the process and policy focus that we've decided to focus the scorecard on. So earlier this year, some of you on the line may have participated in a series of interviews and consultations that we hosted across Canada, and the purpose of that was to learn a little bit more about what was needed in the way of a scorecard and what tools already existed to support some decision making as it relates to smart energy communities. At that time, we had narrowed our focus down to 2 possible streams. The first being an evaluation of performance and outcomes, which includes a more quantitative set of indicators such as energy conserved, greenhouse gas emissions reduced, perhaps energy intensities, or even uptake of energy policies or programs as an example. And then the second was looking at policies and processes, and that entails a little bit more qualitative indicators that focus on the foundation that communities and the many sectors and stakeholders involved in a community could collectively lay to facilitate the transition to a smart energy community. And what we learned in our consultations is that there is, at this point in time, a need to focus on the latter, that the processes and the policies of community stakeholders is really, there's really a gap there, and the scorecard could fill that. So for example, to give you an example of what that would look like, we would look at the extent to which, say, a local utility has dedicated resources, such as perhaps a staff person or multiple staff people, to liaise with a local government or local businesses to share energy data, as one example. Or we might look at the types of initiatives that the real estate sector within the particular community has led to support things like energy efficiency or intensification policies. And then we might look at, for example, the type of governance structure a local government council might have set up to ensure that community energy and perhaps community energy planning has been established as a priority across the community. So again, what we heard is that there is an interest and a gap in that area, and that is one that we've determined the scorecard could fill. And I'll elaborate on that a little bit further in just a moment. In the long term, we would like to capture performance-based indicators, but what we did here in our consultations was that there are a lot of complexities associated with collecting the data, but also comparing that data from community to community across the country. So we've decided that this first iteration will not focus on performance indicators. With that said, it's something we'll continue to investigate as we build out the indicators in this phase of the project. So I'll move on to the next slide, which touches on the main kind of outputs and what the scorecard is really going to look like when it's finished. So over the next 2 years, our teams will be working to reach 3 major milestones. The first is a standardized set of indicators that define the pathway to smart energy communities. So again, those will focus on policies and processes and implementation at the community level. Second, we're going to develop a methodology to evaluate communities, and that will provide us with a framework to categorize and quantify the indicators that we select. And as part of that process, we'll establish categories that we hope will be useful those categories will be weighted in a way that reflects the importance of a particular sector or particular aspect of energy in the community, and that will determine that level of importance in close consultation with the pilot communities and the subject matter experts that we're going to be engaging as part of this project. One of which being ACEEE, who is on the line, who you'll hear from in just a moment. And then the last piece is developing a report and a web-based dashboard that displays both the benchmark for success for what a smart energy community looks like, and which also showcases the community scores and the breakdown of how well a community is doing on different aspects of the transition to a smart energy community. The way we'd like to break down and present the scores is hopefully granular enough to provide communities with a bit of a roadmap for action on how to improve their score. So again, that'll come down to how we categorize the indicators and what we're able to tease out and reflect in terms of strengths and weaknesses for that particular community, to hopefully provide a bit of a sense-making associated with the score. I should also mention that as part of this process, we're hoping to gain insights and perhaps some feedback on the Smart Energy Communities principles. While they have stood the test of time, the world has changed a lot over the last 10 years, and so we do anticipate potentially building in some time to update the principles. So I'm going to move on to elaborate a little bit more on the work we've done to date on indicator development. So the indicators themselves will be developed and refined over approximately 12 months. Again, they'll be developed by the project team and the subject matter experts that we're engaging as part of the project, and then they will be reviewed and refined through the experience of the pilot communities, as well as the Quest and Pollution Probe networks when opportunities arise. The first draft of the indicators that we've developed so far have been based on the Smart Energy Communities principles. And then those indicators have been and will continue to be supplemented with desktop research to incorporate other important aspects of smart energy communities excuse me, that we may not have captured in the first iteration. We also want to cross-reference our indicators with other indicator programs, and we'll be doing that on a continuous basis over the next year. And to give you an example of that, that would be the FCM PCT program, and then we know of other industry association indicator programs that we could cross-reference to make sure. The reason we want to do that is to make sure we're not duplicating efforts for communities, for one. Second, we want to leverage existing programs and data as much as possible, and we want to keep the scorecard as streamlined as possible for the end user. And again, we'll also be working closely with groups like ACEEE to see if there's an opportunity to replicate any indicators that are working well in cities in the United States. An important next step for us will be to ensure that reliable and consistent data is available to inform those indicators. And we want to make sure that that data is available on a continuous basis because we want to continue to develop new iterations of the scorecard over time. Some of the data might be provided by key stakeholders like local governments, utilities, and the real estate sector in a particular community. However, in the consultations that we held earlier this year, we heard very clearly that it will be very important for us to, again, leverage existing data where it is available to reduce the level of effort required of communities to participate in the scorecard. We want to make this scorecard accessible to communities no matter what size they are, no matter how much capacity they might have to participate. So finding existing sets of data will be important for us in this process. I'm going to move on to the methodology. So once, as soon as we determined that our focus would be on process and policy type indicators, we were able to further nuance or segment the types of indicators we wanted to examine. We want the scorecard to be reflective of both the supporting framework for smart energy communities, back to some of the points I was making earlier, as well as actions and implementation happening on the ground. And that is to capture perhaps some of the leading work that might be taking place in absence of, say, a strong policy framework or a strong set of processes in the community. So on the supporting process and the policy framework side of things, we'll look at a spectrum of interventions from utilities, local governments, and the real estate sector. And then on the actions and implementation side, we'll look at actual actions and implementation with respect to things like land use and transportation, buildings, energy use in buildings, waste and distributed energy resources. So again, developing the indicators and the methodology will be an iterative process. We will add, change, remove indicators as we learn from our research, from the pilot communities, and from subject matter experts about what will be relevant to inform decision-making in the work of the participating communities. And once they're developed, we'll look to cluster them in categories. And this part is complex. There's a number of different dimensions that we could consider looking at in terms of clustering the indicators. And you'll soon hear from ACEEE about how they've categorized their indicators, which will provide a little bit of clarity on that. But once those clusters are developed, we'll assign different weights to the indicators, which again should reflect how significant of an impact that particular set of indicators would have on the transition to a smart energy community. One question we're often asked is how we will reflect the role of higher levels of government in the scorecard, and how will we ensure that we're creating a level playing field for communities from different provinces and territories. We know from our research that provinces and territories have a very critical role to play in supporting the transition to a smart energy community. And so as part of this process, we will document and recognize where higher levels of government have either created enabling policies or programs or have provided communities with the authority to support different aspects of smart energy communities. But one of the questions we haven't quite resolved, it's something we're still considering, but we get asked a lot, is as we develop the methodology, whether communities should be scored within the jurisdictional context of what they're allowed to do in their particular province or territory, or if we should exclude enabling policies at senior levels of government from the scoring altogether. So in one instance, the scores would be adjusted so the community's score is not penalized if it's not allowed to implement a particular policy or process. And then in the other case, we would, ignore what is allowed across jurisdictions and score the communities against the benchmark that we set, which defines what a smart energy community looks like. We will also make sure that how we present the results, we would like to present the results in a way that is constructive as possible for communities, insofar that we want to create a framework that allows communities to compare themselves along communities of a similar size and context. So over time, as we update the scorecard, communities will also be able to see how their score is changing over time. I'm going to elaborate a little bit further on the multiple dimensions that we're currently looking at incorporating into the scorecard. So the first dimension, evaluating the supporting framework for smart energy communities. So through this lens, we're going to look at how key sectors, again, local governments, utilities, the real estate sector, for example, in the immediate term, and then perhaps in the longer term, other stakeholder groups like the business community, nonprofit sector, and academic sectors are enabling smart energy communities. And a fundamental assumption in this project is that these stakeholder groups have a highly influential role to play in shaping a smart energy community, as they have a high degree of influence, both with their internal operations as well as in the community at large. For these sectors, we want to examine the foundation that they're laying to support smart energy communities. And to give you an example, again, of what we're referring to, it would be things like the level of leadership within the community, where perhaps, we're looking at how the highest level of decision-making within that stakeholder group is championing the concept of integrated systems thinking as it relates to energy. We'll be looking at governance, engagement processes, resourcing, and many others, things like information and data sharing, which we know is key to making informed decisions at the local level. And so we've developed a spectrum here to define the types of interventions that these many sectors can integrate into their policies and processes. So on one end of the spectrum, it's piecemeal interventions where things are happening without any real order or any real policy or decision-making framework. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have a truly integrated and systems thinking approach to the way energy is managed in the community. So we'll use this framework to further develop our indicators and again inform the benchmark that we're setting. I'll move on to the next slide, evaluating actions and implementation. So this is the second dimension that we are evaluating to reflect the implementation of projects and outcomes on the ground. So we'll look at various measures here through the lens of the entire energy supply chain, so from production to end use. And we're looking at both the climate change mitigation and adaptation side as it relates to energy. And to give you an example of what that would look like, we'll look at things like, again, land use and transportation, buildings, distributed energy resources, energy distribution, and then a non-energy system, so things like waste, water, and vegetation in a community. So just moving to the next slide, some final thoughts on the approach and considerations that we're going to be building into the scorecard. So again, just building on the consultation we did at the start of this year, We heard many perspectives across Canada in terms of what would be useful to reflect in the scorecard. So we heard it would be important for it to be accessible to all communities, regardless of their size or capacity. So that's something we're building into the design to make sure it's accessible to communities, especially small and medium communities who might not have a tremendous amount of capacity to participate. We heard that communities don't necessarily want to be compared with communities across the country more broadly, but rather we've narrowed it down to here that communities would find it most useful to compare themselves against communities of a similar size and context, oftentimes in close proximity to themselves. So that's something we'll try and reflect in the final product of the scorecard, so the report and the dashboard. We also heard it will be very important to not reinvent the wheel and create more work for communities. So again, we're going to take steps to align this project with existing programs that are already in place. We heard that the scorecard would become tremendously valuable if communities can start to track their progress over time. So again, this is something we are committed to and see value in and hope to update it on an ongoing basis, possibly biannually, so that communities can see their progress over time. So that really concludes kind of the summary of some of the approaches and considerations we are building in. So just before I wrap up and hand off the presentation to Dave, I want to pause here. We have a couple of polls that we want to administer. They'll only take about 30 seconds, maybe a minute. Samantha is going to administer the first one, and then we'll do the second one, just to get some initial off-the-cuff reactions from you in terms of your perspective of the scorecard. So the first question, Samantha, if you are ready to administer it, is to what extent is the purpose of the scorecard and how it can be used clear to you? So we'll post that up. You can see it pop up on your screen, and if you can just take a quick moment to vote, we'll let you input your responses. And Samantha, you just let me know when you want to close the poll, and then we'll move on to the second question.
Yeah, no problem. We'll give everyone a couple, like 30 more seconds. Okay, great. Sarah, I'm going to close this one and we can maybe launch the second one.
Okay, perfect. So the second question is, to what extent is the scorecard likely to be relevant to your work? So we'll get Samantha to post that one up. And again, if you can input your responses, we'll give you about 30 seconds to respond, and then we will move to wrap up.
I'm realizing now too, Sarah, I think the questions were backwards, but people seem to have understood them, so.
Oh, okay.
We'll give everyone again like 30 more seconds or so, and then I think we'll be good to go.
Okay, super.
Okay, great, Sarah. I think we'll close that poll.
Okay, so I'll just finish up with a few comments on how to get involved in the project and what some of the next steps are. The best way to stay involved on updates on the project is to sign up for the Quest newsletter. Our national newsletter will be sending all of our project updates through there. Pollution Probe will also be sending updates through their newsletter, and you can sign up on their website. Another key way to get involved is through the call for expressions of interest for 6 pilot communities. So that call closes at the end of the day on Friday. You can find the information at questcanada.org/scorecard. And if you have any questions about the pilot community's involvement in the scorecard, you can reach out to either myself or Samantha. And lastly, of course, social media. You can follow Quest and Pollution Probe, and you'll see ongoing updates there. So with that, we are going to pass it off to David Ribeiro, who's a senior researcher at ACEEE and the lead author of the ACEEE City Efficiency Scorecard. And he's going to talk to us a little bit more about that scorecard. It's currently in its third iteration, I believe, and he's going to talk about the approach that ACEEE has taken and the value that the scorecard has generated for communities across the U.S.
And so before yeah, and I can introduce David in a second here. I just wanted to remind everyone before we switch over presentations here that if you do have any questions or clarification, just please again remember to type them into the question box. We are collecting them as they come in, and we will address them at the end of this presentation by Dave. So you are all on mute. You cannot talk, so please type in your questions in the question box. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to turn things over to Dave, who will be giving a brief overview of their city scorecard down in the States. So thank you so much, Dave.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the introduction, Samantha. And first off, can you hear me and also see my screen?
We can hear and see you.
Perfect. Okay, very good. So I'm happy to be talking today about our experiences in the U.S. with the City Energy Efficiency Scorecard. As Samantha was saying, I lead our City Energy Efficiency Scorecard, both the 2015 and 2017 editions. So there's quite a bit in my presentation, so I think I'm just going to jump right in and we can get going. So there are three components I'm hoping to cover today. The first is just an overview of what the City Scorecard is. The second is to discuss some of the results from the most recent scorecard so folks can have an understanding of what comes out of this effort every year, or every other year rather, and how it can be used. And then finally, we'll look at some trends from the most recent edition of the report. So first we'll start out with that overview of the scorecard, answering, what is it essentially? So the City Scorecard is a report we release every 2 years, benchmarking the energy efficiency efforts of 51 large cities in the U.S. We generally focus on the central cities of the largest metro regions in the U.S. We released the first edition in 2013, the second edition in 2015, and this past spring had our third edition, the 2017 City Scorecard. The scorecard has a few goals. To start, it's the first report to rank cities exclusively on their energy efficiency efforts. By doing so, it identifies those that excel, as well as those who have the most room for improvement. In the process, it creates some friendly competition among the cities in the report to move up the rankings and by doing so, increase their levels of energy efficiency. Second, the focus on policies and other initiatives is really meant to identify actions cities can take to improve efficiency. By doing so, the scorecard offers the beginnings of a roadmap for any local government aiming to improve its city's energy efficiency. Cities can see where they're doing well, but more importantly, where they're not doing quite as well, and get some ideas for policies that they might want to prioritize in future planning processes. The scorecard is also filled with examples of cities implementing many best practice policies, so folks can benefit from the lessons of other cities by using the examples from their peers that are compiled in the City Scorecard. So in the report, we assess cities across 5 policy areas, the 5 you see up here. We have over 50 plus policy metrics in the report that are organized into one of these 5 policy areas. So I'll just run through them briefly. The first is local government operations. So here we focus on what cities can do to make their own operations more efficient. Second, we have community-wide initiatives. This focuses on cross-cutting topics that affect overall community-wide energy use. For example, here we look at efforts to mitigate urban heat islands, as well as planning for combined heat and power or district energy. Third, we focus on energy efficiency efforts for private buildings. Fourth, we evaluate the energy efficiency offerings of energy utilities serving cities. including whether those offerings reach underserved segments of the population. We also look in this chapter at efforts of drinking water and wastewater utilities serving cities. And then finally, we have the transportation policies area. Here we look at transportation system efficiency, so things like transit, efficiency of the freight system, location efficiency, and we also look at vehicle policies. Well, this is the point distribution among the policy areas of the report, and a couple labels are not showing up, but the maximum number of points that cities can earn across the report is 100. Local government operations, the one area you can see, is 10 points, which is actually a change from past reports. We used to provide 15 points in the local government operations section, but we reduced it to 10 here. Our analysis of energy data basically showed that local government energy use doesn't typically exceed 5% of community-wide energy consumption. This new point allocation more closely approximates the sector share of community-wide energy use while still reflecting the importance of leading by example. The largest areas are transportation policies and buildings, which would be these two actually. And so transportation receives 30 points and buildings receives 28. So what we have here is just an added level of detail. In the table, you can see the 5 policy areas again: local government operations, community-wide initiatives, buildings, and so on and so forth. But you can also see the categories of the metrics within each of these policy areas. Each of these categories then further have the individual metrics nested under them. We evaluate cities on best practice policy metrics. They score cities based on nuanced, qualitative policy information. Cities earn points for policies that will lead to more efficient outcomes. So, for example, take community-wide energy efficiency goals here. Well, what is this? What does it mean? Here we assess cities based on targets they've established to save energy use citywide. Where we can, we go beyond policy adoption to score cities based upon policy implementation. So again, we could think about the community-wide goals. So not only do we score cities based on the existence of their goals, but we also assess cities based on the progress they have achieved towards those goals as well. I spoke before about some of the methodology changes we made in this edition in terms of reducing points in local government operations. We also made some changes to individual metrics because we are always looking to update the scorecard so that it is capturing innovative policies and new areas that cities should be paying attention to. So in this edition, we made a number of changes, but a couple notable ones are those highlighted in red here. So these efforts, both in energy and water utilities and transportation policies, we aim to assess efforts to bring energy efficiency to underserved markets, particularly low-income and multifamily households. So in energy and water utilities, we look at the utility offerings for programs that serve low-income and multifamily households. And in transportation policies, we look at incentives or other policies that are looking to increase the availability of transit options in affordable housing communities. I won't go into more detail because there's a lot of things I could talk about here, but I'm happy to address any questions during the Q&A. So next we'll dive into the results. So here we'll start with a discussion of the top cities, then we'll spend some time with the leading cities from some policy areas, and finally we'll spend some time on the most improved cities, highlighting those folks who improved by the largest margin since last time. So here we have the map containing the ranks of the cities from the 2017 scorecard. For the 3rd edition in a row, so that would be all editions of the scorecard, Boston took the top spot, as you can see here. New York was 2nd again, and then we have Seattle in the Northwest, who was 3rd. From there, we see top 10 cities scattered across the country with representation on both coasts, as well as the Midwest, Mountain West, and Texas. Now, the cities in blue, those are the ones that are ranked 11th to 20th overall. And they give us an interesting story this year. Several of them made significant jumps. In fact, 3 of the 4 most improved cities are in this grouping, as you can see by the stars next to San Diego, Phoenix, and Kansas City here. Beyond the most improved cities, we also have other very large improvements. So if you take Orlando down here, it jumped 10 spots to 20th overall due to myriad policy activity, including its recently adopted building energy and water efficiency strategy. You can also take a look at this map regionally and see that every region from the Northeast, Southeast, Midwest to West has at least one city in the top 20. So there is really positive developments to point to throughout the U.S. Now let's take a couple minutes to take a deeper look at Boston. So the city maintained its top spot, as I was saying before, and improved by 2.5 points in the process. The city continues to do well across the board, but really does well for its buildings policies and earns perfect marks for its energy and water utilities. The best way to really get a feel for how well they're doing is to take a look at the chart that's up here. So I'll just walk through it quickly. You can see we have each of the 5 policy areas here, and then these 3 bars representing different point totals. So the dark gray bar are the maximum number of points available. The second is the median score across all 51 cities in the report, and then the green one here is what Boston achieved. So you could see in each case how Boston did better than the median, which helps to explain why it's doing well. But if you look at building policies and energy and water utilities here, you can really see the difference between the light gray and the green that shows they're doing quite well in those policy areas. So I'm going to actually just focus on those quickly rather than talking about all of Boston's initiatives. So starting with buildings, Boston adopted the Massachusetts Stretch Energy Code, which actually requires new buildings or those undergoing major renovations to exceed the base energy code by 20%. And the city also adopted the Building Energy Reporting and Disclosure Ordinance in April of 2013. That actually requires commercial buildings to benchmark their energy and water use using something called Energy Star Portfolio Manager, which is something that is run by the EPA here in the States, and cities can use to require their building owners to benchmark their energy use. That's the software. And that ordinance also requires the data to be reported to the city annually. So looking at energy and water utilities, the first thing to point to is the Renew Boston program, which is actually a partnership between Boston and its utilities, Eversource and National Grid. It informs Boston residents and businesses about utility-sponsored energy efficiency services. And also both of the city's utilities, as I was saying, Eversource and National Grid, they also invest heavily in their energy efficiency programs. So this was just a very quick sneak peek of how Boston did. But if folks are interested in more details on Boston, feel free to click through the link at the bottom of the page here to get more information. And we have the same thing for all 51 cities in the report. So if there's a city you're particularly interested in from the States, I encourage you to take a look at that. Beyond recognizing those cities who are doing well overall, we can also cut the data in ways that allow us to look at those who are excelling in specific policy areas. So rather than going through all 5 policy areas, I'm just going to quickly go through buildings, utilities, and transportation. So when it comes to buildings, there are really a number of cities who are paving the way when it comes to reducing high energy consumption in buildings. I'd say Boston, Los Angeles, Austin, New York, and Seattle are the leaders. They have the 5 highest scores. So here I have some information on Boston and LA. I obviously just spent some time talking about Boston, so I'll just add a couple other notes. I already talked about their stretch code, but something else they received points for here is their compliance efforts with that code. They also have a requirement, Article 37, that requires projects to receive a certifiable level of the LEED certification. So that's something else I didn't mention before. When it comes to Los Angeles, there's a number of things we can point to as well. Their existing buildings, energy, and water efficiency program has established energy auditing and retrofitting requirements for commercial and multifamily buildings. As part of that program, the city requires all buildings over 20,000 square feet to annually benchmark energy and water use. They also have a successful PACE program there, and they also enforce the 2016 California Energy Code. So all examples of things that cities could potentially emulate who are interested in buildings policies, which is something I'll pick up on again later in the presentation. So here, we are going to talk quickly about energy and water utilities. So Boston, San Francisco, and Seattle earned top scores, and that was due in part because of local policy, but also due to actions of the utilities serving their cities. So again, Boston, as I said, is at the top, and there's a reason that they are at the top overall, because they did well in all these policy areas. I also mentioned Renew Boston before, so I won't go into that, but a couple other things to mention. The city is a strong advocate at the state level for additional spending requirements for energy efficiency projects for all utilities. And they also earn points because they sit on something called the Energy Efficiency Advisory Council, and they actively advocate for policies requiring utilities to expand the availability and granularity of energy use data. We also can take a look at Seattle. Just like Boston, they have high levels of spending and savings on the utility energy efficiency programs. Seattle City Light, the energy utility, also provides funding to the low-income weatherization program administered by the City of Seattle, and provides efficiency measures to single-family and multifamily low-income properties rather. And Seattle also has a water system plan that helped it earn some points for its water utility activities. Then we'll wrap it up with transportation policies. So two cities clearly rose to the top here, Portland and New York City. So this is one of the places where Boston did not lead. Both Portland and New York City have several initiatives to reduce energy use in the transportation system, as you can see from the slide. So to start with Portland, their transportation system plan includes goals to increase the amount of commuters and residents that bike and walk to get around town. Their zoning code works to increase location efficiency. It encourages mixed use and infill development along all portions of the city's main streets. And then they are one of the few cities to have a plan to increase energy efficiency in freight. There are only 2 to 3 cities across the scorecard who have such a freight strategy. Now turning to New York, so their Department of Transportation strategic plan focuses on safe, green, smart, and equitable transportation. Their plan outlines 105 initiatives, so there's plenty in there. Some of the things that are included are street safety to encourage walking, expanding bike lanes, and enhancing transit. Like Portland, their zoning code designates special purpose districts for the creation of mixed-use developments in the city. And then they have a inclusionary housing program, which is referenced up here, R10, that includes several incentives to encourage developers to build affordable homes in transit-served areas. So as you can see from these last 3 slides, in addition to cities just getting information on how they're doing, we're able to really look at each individual policy area and see who the leaders are and pull out some examples for peers who are interested in, stealing some of those best practices and replicating it in their own communities. So now I wanted to turn back to the most improved cities that I mentioned a few minutes ago. After all, by doing this report every couple of years, we get a chance to see how scores have changed and who has improved and why they've done so. So these cities show that by embracing efficiency, cities can improve and in some cases do it pretty quickly. So as I was saying earlier, there are 4 most improved cities, 3 of them in the Southwest, and the other one is Kansas City in the Midwest. So this table here helps explain how they did so well in this edition as compared to the 2015 edition. So Los Angeles really earns double accolades in the report. They were already a top 10 city, in fact a top 5 city, but they were also the most improved city overall, increasing its score by 25 points since 2015. Since our first scorecard in 2013, Los Angeles has gone from 28th overall to 4th. So it has by far had the largest improvement across all cities in the scorecard during the lifetime of the scorecard. A big reason for its improvement this time was their new energy and water efficiency program that was listed up here that I talked about in a little more detail a couple slides ago. Following closely behind LA is San Diego, who improved its score by 24 points. The policies adopted as part of their climate action plan led to some of the improvement. So, for example, the Climate Action Plan codifies goals to reduce energy use by 15% in select homes and to reduce community-wide emissions by 15% by 2020. It also has goals to reduce vehicle miles traveled and reduce GHG emissions from the transportation sector. Next, we have Kansas City, who increased its score by 14 points, moving up 8 spots in the process. The highlight among the city's achievements was the adoption of the Energy Empowerment Ordinance, which requires energy benchmarking in large buildings. And then rounding out the most improved is Phoenix, capturing the 14th spot overall with an improvement of 13 points. The city increased its score due to the adoption of its 2050 environmental sustainability goals, which include both energy savings and climate goals. It also has a target calling for 40% of the population to commute by walking, biking, transit, or car share. So now we'll take a bit of a step back, not looking at individual cities, but rather focusing on some trends. And what we'll see is that cities are improving, which is great, but there's still a lot of work that can be done. So the first trend to note is that cities' scores are improving. So if you take a look at this graph, you have change in points from the 2015 edition on the y-axis and the cities themselves on the x-axis. So rather than listing the individual cities, we group them into tiers of 10. So tier 1 here, tier 1 is the top 10, tier 2 is 11 through 20, and then you have the rest of the tiers going all the way out to City 51 up here. What you can see is that most cities are improving. The number of cities that made sizable gains is really impressive. 32 cities of the 51 cities improved their score, and 11 of them did so by double digits. So we see big improvements here. But getting back to one of my other points from earlier, the tier 2 cities really saw substantial improvement. So these are the cities that are ranked 11th to 20th overall. Each city in the tier improved, and the median change was an increase of 12 points, which was sizable and larger than the median across any other tier. I think many of these cities are really beginning to emerge as energy efficiency leaders. So this includes cities like San Diego, Phoenix, and Orlando. I think we'll likely see them knocking on the door of the top 10 sooner rather than later. When assessing scoring changes, we need to take a look at the policy activity to assess whether scoring changes are due to the methodology changes, because as I mentioned, we do make changes from year to year to capture new innovative policies, or if the changes were due to policy activity. As we dug in, we really saw that cities have made progress since 2015, especially when it comes to their buildings policies. So this summarizes some of the developments since the 2015 report. We found that 8 new cities had adopted benchmarking and transparency policies or advanced those that were already on the books, and you could see the cities listed up there. In addition, 7 cities adopted more stringent building energy codes since the last edition of the report. We also have 4 cities who have adopted new community-wide energy savings target, which brings up the total of cities who have set energy or climate goals to 15. Then we see a number of positive developments for transportation as well. 3 new cities have adopted vehicle mile travel reduction targets, and 75% of cities have bike share programs, which is an increase from the 50% in 2015. The past 2 slides are encouraging. Cities are clearly prioritizing efficiency and doing so in different ways. However, there's still a lot of room to do more. So here we have all of the city scores, and you can see that only 1 city, Boston, earned more than 80% of the points, and only 18 earned more than 50% of the points. This is an improvement from last time. Last time only 13 cities earned half the points, but clearly there's still more that all cities can do, even folks at the top like Boston who still have another 15 plus points before attaining a perfect score. So after seeing that, we wanted to dig in a little bit and see where cities can improve by the largest margin. And this chart helps us figure that out a bit. So we converted each city score in a policy area into a percentage and charted them out here. So we found some interesting observations, especially for buildings and transportation. So you can see in local government operations, community-wide, and energy utilities, there's a somewhat even distribution across the spectrum here. In buildings, we see that there's clearly a cohort of cities at the top who have established themselves as the clear leader for buildings policies, with everyone else under 70% here, or near or below 70%. But what we really noticed was transportation. So only 2 cities earned more than 70% of the available points for transportation. So it seems like there's the most room for improvement when it comes to transportation policies. Okay, so now I'm just going to give a brief recap before throwing it back to Sarah and Samantha. So as I started out saying, the scorecard is really a report benchmarking the energy efficiency efforts of large cities. It highlights specific actions cities can take, and by doing so can inform the policymaking process in those cities. Our findings show that cities continue to pursue efficiency. Boston, New York, and Seattle are clearly leading the way, but we see lots of improvement across the board, with over 60% of cities improving their score and doing so by a wider margin than in the previous report. Like I said, LA, San Diego, Kansas City, and Phoenix are the most improved. But cities can certainly do more, with only 18 cities earning more than 50% of the points. Cities can peruse their findings to create roadmaps for improvement, but there are foundational policies cities can pursue to save energy, including setting goals or adopting or advocating for more stringent building codes, for example, or even working to reduce VMTs in transportation. So the report is a way to share best practices among cities so that peers who are interested in replicating best practices in their own cities can do so. So with that, I will turn it back to Sarah and Samantha, and certainly happy to answer any questions during the Q&A.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dave. I will flip things back to us here and give some chances for people to type in their questions after hearing your presentation. Just for everyone's benefit who is on the line, we have many of the team members from the Quest Canada team who are critical to the moving forward of this project. We also have members from the Pollution Probe team who are collaborating with us on the development and of the scorecard. And then Dave will also be on the line throughout the question period as well to hopefully answer any questions that you may have about ACEEE Scorecard. So there's many people on the line to answer your questions, so I am looking forward to seeing some of those come in. And while we wait for them, we can get started with the ones that did come in earlier. So the first question that came in was, will the scorecard use or integrate energy mapping tools, i.e. City Insight, that some municipalities have as part of their municipal energy plan? So I can maybe turn that over to you, Sarah.
Can you hear me? It's Michael Lee calling in.
Yeah, Michael, you can answer that as well.
Yeah, so I can address the first question. So the short answer is yes. The scorecard will certainly integrate decision support tools like energy mapping and other tools and approaches that might be considered as well are things like cost-benefit analyses and life cycle costing activities.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michael. The next question here is, will slides be made available, and will any communities in Quebec included? I can answer that first half of the question and pass it along to one of my colleagues to answer the second half. Slides will be available. We also have been recording the webinar as well, so we will be releasing a recorded version of the webinar on our website and can also send it around to the folks here online. But I can pass it over to my colleagues to answer the second half, which is, will any communities in Quebec be included?
So at this point, we are still, the expression of interest application is still open. So we are definitely going to consider communities in Quebec who apply to become a pilot community. And beyond kind of this 2-year pilot phase of the scorecard, we're certainly going to look to include communities in Quebec, as we hope that the scorecard will incorporate communities from all across Canada.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michael. Moving on, for the 6 pilot communities for the scorecard, are you looking for municipalities that have more access to data, or will you be addressing data access issues as well through the process?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So at this point, we want to include communities who are experienced with data collection so that we can help document those leading practices. But it was brought up kind of previous meetings that we are also going to consider including other communities who have had challenges, as the experience of going through these challenges would also be of help to a lot of communities as well. So the short answer would be yes, we're looking for both, I suppose.
Fantastic. Thanks again, Michael. A question for you, Dave. Looking at the ACEEE Scorecard, I see mostly large cities. Do you have small and medium municipalities that participate, i.e. under 100,000 in population?
So in the city scorecard, we don't. So the smaller cities would be the Portlands and the Minneapolises who have a floor of, it's more than 100,000. But we do have something called a self-scoring tool, which takes our city scorecard, all of its metrics, the methodology, and puts it into a Excel tool that any city can use to score itself. And that's something we sort of just release out there, and cities who are interested in scoring themselves can do so. So through that process, we have had some smaller communities, as small as 10,000 people, who have used the tool. But the report itself does focus on larger cities. So we focus on the central cities of the 50 largest metro regions in the U.S.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dave. And another question for you as well. Is the ACEEE scorecard self-reported by the participating municipalities? And what verification is done by ACEEE about the submissions?
Sure. So we gather data a few different ways. In some cases it's desktop research, but we have two data requests which are vital to the process. So one would be a data request that does go to city offices. So in the US it would be sustainability offices for the most part. And those cities would report their information on policies and send it back to us. Because this is something we've done for 3 years now, we have a bit of a process where cities are just updating the information they have reported previously. And then we also have a data request that goes to the utilities who are serving those cities. And that covers the energy and water utility chapter. In terms of the verification of that data, whenever the city reports back to us, we require them to source the information so that ACEEE staff can go and verify it. There are some things that are difficult to verify. So if we are asking about whether an energy manager is on staff and they say yes and say what department they're in, that's the sort of thing we might not verify. We would have to take cities at their word. But when it comes to policies they've adopted, programs that they're running, those are all things that ACEEE staff would double check to ensure that the city should earn points for those initiatives.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dave. This next question, I think it's best for Michael and maybe Sarah, and maybe if Dave, you have anything to add afterwards, that would be fantastic. But the question is, it appears that the U.S. scorecard just presented is well established. Why not simply adopt this scorecard rather than spend 2 years developing a Canadian version?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think some things that will distinguish our scorecard from the ACEEE scorecard would be that they are looking at the large cities. I believe the way they selected things was by just going after the largest cities, and we are hoping that we can also incorporate smaller communities within Canada. Another potential sort of difference between the two would be that they have a separate scorecard for utilities as well as for the state scorecard, whereas I think we're hoping to integrate within our Smart Energy Communities Scorecard not just local governments but also utilities and the real estate sector into our one. And there are also some slight governance and jurisdictional differences between Canadian and U.S. cities, but I will say that we do recognize that it would be really interesting if we could and we will definitely consider seeing how we can integrate R2 so that we could potentially have some kind of comparison between and alignment between our scorecard and their scorecard.
And maybe this is just Dave, I'll just jump in for a second. But I know this was something Sarah was speaking to before. You know, it can get very tricky to assess folks when you have to really begin taking into account local context and difference between, you know, different government jurisdictions. So just speaking for the U.S., there are places in the city scorecard where we had to develop 2 tracks or 3 tracks for specific metrics to sort of account for differences between cities and different states. And I'm sure, you know, if that exercise is done for Canada, there are going to be those other differences as well, which I guess echoes what you were just saying, Mike. So just another example where it can get very tricky when it gets into the weeds of what the specific metrics and scoring tracks can be.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Dave. That's the last of the questions that come in. I'll give everyone a couple more minutes here just to forward any other questions that may come up. But in the meantime, I'll just reiterate what Sarah said at the end of her presentation. In order to make sure that you are staying engaged, and if you have any more questions, please definitely sign up for the Quest newsletter. You can do that via our website, which is listed here on the PowerPoint slide. Again, if you are a municipality in the line and you haven't done so already and you are interested in being one of those 6 pilot communities, please apply on or before December 15th, if that's this Friday. The deadline closes at 5 p.m. Eastern, and you can apply via our website as well at questcanada.org/scorecard. And you can also follow us on Twitter. Both Pollution Probe, our partner, and ourselves will be constantly posting updates. And yeah, as mentioned again, I will reiterate that this webinar will be circulated. It has been recorded, so if you missed anything or need further clarification, you can definitely reference this webinar. With that being said as well, since I don't see any more questions come in, if something does come up after the webinar or you mull on it for a couple hours here and something comes up, please feel free to reach out to myself or Sarah or Michael, someone from the project team. We are happy to answer any further questions you may have about the scorecard, and we can always forward the questions along to Dave as well if you do have questions for ACEEE. With that being said, I want to give a huge thanks to our presenters, Sarah, as well as Dave today for taking the time out and giving us a brief overview of the scorecard here in Canada, as well as the scorecard down in the States that ACEEE is diligently working on a variety of levels. And again, I want to welcome or thank you, big thanks to Michael Lee, who has answered some of our burning questions. And thank you to you all who have joined on today to learn a little bit more. We really appreciate your time and your interest in this, and we are hoping that this becomes an extremely successful project that we can continue to reference from years on. With that being said, I'm wishing everyone a safe and happy holiday season, and we look forward to staying connected as the project develops out some more. Thank you so much, and have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.